I'm excited about this new segment we're starting here today. It's called LOL, Left on Left, right? Where the left criticizes itself and laughs so we don't have to cry because it makes you want to cry out there nowadays if you see what the left has turned into. And I got a special co host for this segment over here. You know him, ladies and gentlemen. He's been on the show a couple times. That is Pasta to Go, the Convo Couch. He's been on AM Wake Up when I hosted that show. He's awesome. He writes for Covert Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Kuzmarov is here.
Great to be with you.
Hey, man, great to have you. So, Jeremy, this type of segment, we're going to get ourselves in trouble with a few people out there because I think when you provide information with a lot of context, especially from the left, and you're criticizing the left, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. I think a lot of synthetic leftists out there would rather have Republicans attack them or just mainstream Republicans because they go after the culture war BS and they say things like the radical left. I mean, we're going to get ourselves in trouble over here in a good way.
Well, I think it's important. I think too often you see a herd mentality, and I think it's always important to maintain independent critical thinking. And yeah, that sometimes gets you in trouble, but I think it's really important.
Well, that's very, very interesting, my friend. And there's a few things I want to iron out as we get started. Today's segment, we're going to be talking about Alexei Navalny because the left has just been falling over themselves lately when it comes to this whole situation. But before we get started, I have to vet you properly. So I hope you don't mind. I have a few questions because your last name is Kuzmarov. You know that?
Yes, I do. Yes.
You know that, but it sounds very Russian. Are you, in fact, of Russian ethnicity?
Well, my family is originally from Russia. My great uncle fought in the Russian Revolution, but I was born in Canada.
So you were not born in Russia.
No,
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
no,
Have you ever eaten borscht more than twice in 1 week?
no,
Do you ever use the term "niet" instead of "no"?
no.
Okay, good. Then you're good. We can go along and get this show done and get it rocking and rolling. So let's talk about this. I want to unpack a few things because, like I said, they have been mentioning Alexei Navalny like crazy. This is Dances with Bears right over here. And this is John Helmer. And it says Navalny organization splits into whites and reds as lies multiply. Alexei Navalny's organization outside of Russia is now repudiating Mrs. Navalny's mother, for having accepted the medical evidence and official certification that the cause of his death was an embolism or a blood clot, which stopped his heart. On Monday, several days after the release of the post-mortem documents and Navalny's body to his mother's custody, Maria Pevchek, Navalny's scriptwriter, and Kira Yarmish, Navalny's press secretary, have repeated their allegations that Navalny had been murdered. Never let science get in the way of a good BS story. In their revised version of the story on Monday, Pelvicek claimed a self-produced video that on February 16, 2024, Vladimir Putin killed Alexei Navalny. Reuters, the New York-based news agency, reported Pevchek's claim, adding that Maria Pevchek, who is based outside of Russia, did not present documentary evidence for her assertion. The New York Times amplified Pevchek's allegations, but omitted and the Reuters qualifier. The newspaper did not report attempting to make contact with Ms. Navalny, but added this innuendo. It remained unclear whether his family would seek to conduct an independent autopsy before his burial. Alexei Navalny could be sitting in this seat right now today, Pevchek broadcast. That's not a figure of speech. It could and should have happened. Navalny was supposed to be free in the coming days. Let's look. Pevchek then recited details and purported exchange of Russian spies in prison outside Russia in exchange for Navalny and Americans in Russian prisons. The NATO-funded Bellingcat organization was involved, Pevchek said. Investor Hristo Grozzev helped us devise and implement this plan. Negotiations took place with American and German officials, she said, but they did nothing. She then said Roman Abramovich was the one who delivered the proposal to swap Navalny to Putin, as an informal negotiator communicating with American and European officials at the same time representing Putin, an unofficial channel of communication with the Kremlin. And that is from Dances with Bears. Let's bring Jeremy in right away. Jeremy, they say Bellingcat was involved. Maybe you can give a little insight to who Bellingcat is.
Well, Bellingcat is funded. It's been reported that it received funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, and basically, it's an intelligence front that smears Russia and China, any U.S. enemy, and basically promotes war propaganda. You could say, and they're really not credible as a source. They were promoting myths about Syria and chemical weapon, Bashir al-Assad, and trying to smear anybody who carried out an independent investigation. And the head of Bellingcat, had no background. He didn't even graduate from college. He had no background in science or politics. So it's not a very credible organization.
In your mind, was Navalny really a political prisoner?
Well, there's evidence that indicated he was not. I personally, I think the sentence may have been too harsh, but he was involved in a scheme with his brother, Oleg Navalny, where they pushed the Yves Rocher French cosmetics company, because his brother Oleg he worked at the post office, so he was using his position to basically pressure Yves Rocher to use a logistics company owned by the Navalnys, and they were convicted of embezzling the equivalent of 850,000 US dollars. Oleg was sent to prison. Alexei was given a suspended sentence, but he was not allowed to leave Russia. And when he left, he was arrested legitimately when he came back. And he had actually violated those orders of not leaving Russia at least 6 times, and he got away with it. But finally, he was arrested. Then he was also charged with political extremism, and he does have a background of promoting racist, anti-immigrant views and videos where he compared Chechen migrants to cockroaches and called for stamping them out. And this is a guy who's being heroized in a lot of liberal media as some kind of Nelson Mandela type figure.
Yeah, it's funny because Donald Trump did compare himself to Navalny, right? And I think there's where the commonality is, right? I mean, Donald Trump doesn't call immigrants cockroaches. He calls them rapists and murderers sometimes, whatnot. So there is some, and they both love guns. So I guess there is some similarities. I want to talk about this though, because here's the thing that just drives me crazy. Consortium News made this report. To see the way the mainstream media, especially the leftist mainstream media, and I guess the mainstream media on the left nowadays, Jeremy, is much more anti-Putin, anti-Russia than the right-wing media. I mean, however, they still kind of praised Alexei Navalny just as much. This is by Consortium News. Worthy and unworthy victims, Navalny and Lira. As we know, Gonzalo Lira died in a Ukrainian prison and almost got no attention. While Alexei Navalny's death commanded 24-hour coverage, Gonzalo Lira's death in the Ukraine was virtually ignored. Alan McLeod on why one death apparently mattered so much more to the U.S. corporate media. Mint Press conducted a quantitative analysis of the media coverage of the two political figures who recently died in prison. Alexei Navalny and Gonzalo Lira. Both were controversial characters and critics of the governments that imprisoned them. Both died under suspicious circumstances. Their families both maintained they were effectively murdered. And both died in the past 6 weeks. Navalny in February and Lira in January. A crucial difference in their stories, however, is that Navalny perished in an Arctic penal colony after being arrested in Russia, an enemy of the state, while Lira's life ended in a Ukrainian prison abandoned by the pro-Kiev government in Washington, D.C. I mean, they barely even mentioned him. I don't even know if the mainstream media ever mentioned him, but we'll look at it some more as we have some actual data. The study compared the coverage of Navalny and Lira's death in 5 leading outlets: the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC News, Fox News, and CNN over 6 days. These outlets were chosen for their reach and influence, and together could be said to reasonably represent the corporate media spectrum as a whole. The data was compiled using the Dow Jones Factiva News database and searches on the websites of the news organizations. This study takes no position on the matter of Navalny, Lira, or the Russian-Ukrainian war, which is why I love this study. And if you look at it, media coverage of the deaths of Alexei Navalny and Gonzalo Lira, the New York Times, And this is Navalny in the green and Lira in the blue. The New York Times mentioned Navalny 151 times. I left my newspaper off to the side, and I was supposed to have my newspaper hat. I wasn't prepared here. I wasn't ready. But it's just crazy the way you see they present this guy as the biggest hero on the face of the earth. Washington Post mentioned Navalny 75 times to 0 for Gonzalo Lira. How about ABC News? 177 times in 6 days and 0 for the ABC News. 215 for Fox News. And one time Fox News, hooray for you, mentioned Gonzalo Lira. And CNN, 113 times for Navalny and 0 for Lira. Do you think, in your opinion, let's bring it back in, Jeremy, do you think, in your opinion, this has a lot to do with the Tucker Carlson interview, that they were trying to take away a lot of energy? I mean, I'm going to bring up, after I play this video, I'm going to bring up a piece of your article too as well, because I've been mentioning, Jeremy, that the United States, regardless of all the pushback, even that little pocket of populist conservatives in the Congress that's pushing back against funding the Ukrainian war, this is about the United States military industrial complex and the government shaking that piggy bank, trying to jostle another coin out for funding no matter what. Do you think, though, as well, it's also about putting out the fires that Tucker Carlson possibly, created with his interview of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, well, and if I could just make one point before answering that, also, Ilya Kiva was the head of the Socialist Party in the Ukraine parliament, and he was assassinated. We know that, and Ukraine bragged about assassinating him, and this is never mentioned. Where in the Navalny case, we don't know at all if Putin ordered that. It seems likely he didn't. So just another example of the complete media bias. And to get to your question, and double standards, to get to your question, I think so. Yeah, they're clearly trying to exploit. These media and I think the intelligence agencies and government are behind this to exploit Navalny's death. To push back against the Republicans, to show how evil they want to remind people just how evil Putin is, and they're trying to mobilize public opinion in the face of. I think the Republican pushback in Congress reflects a huge percentage of the American population who sees wasted taxpayer dollars. I once heard Jimmy Dore gave a great speech where he said how we could use that $100 billion. We could cure homelessness in American cities. We can fight and cure cancer. We could set up the greatest schools in the world. And instead, that's money going into a sinkhole, into Ukraine, an unwinnable war. A lot of the weapons are being stolen, resold on the black market. And it's just deja vu for Afghanistan. And Americans aren't stupid. They see that. So the elite has to work so hard to kind of condition the people to hate Russia and go into overdrive, as you say. So they're exploiting this Navalny issue. They're issuing these films, giving them Academy Awards. Last night in my city, I went to the screening of this film about Mariupol, and it was totally one-sided, to present the Russians as barbarians, essentially. So they're going into overdrive, and I think the Navalny is part of that.
The Time magazine, where they were kind of portraying, Putin on the cover as, Genghis Khan, right? They just go into overdrive. And something that really we should point out too as well is that, there was a guy I played on last week's show that was in Moscow, and he was showing one of these protests. I don't think there was 20 people there in that protest in Moscow for Navalny. Really, this guy was polling at less than 8% in most of all your polls in Russia right now. I don't think Putin would have cared if he would have tried to run against him in the election. Putin's approval rating is somewhere in the high 75%. There's a few people out there that say that Putin's a bastard, but they say that he's our bastard. Alexei Navalny is just a creation, I think, and, we don't have the proof on this that he's a CIA puppet, but, WikiLeaks did point out that there were certain factions that Navalny took place that were funded directly from the CIA, especially his wife. But I want to play this clip real quick for you, really quickly, to show you, because it's really, this is not just the left media too as well. We have a little Fox clip as well, because we can't leave them out of this. But the leftist media, and with the independent left media, which I think a lot of people have to understand, when you talk about, shows like Democracy Now! Or other people out there, it's a business, and it's not financially advantageous to go against state narratives. So sometimes you tend to capitulate, and it really does suck that you see some people that we might have revered, really relished back in the days, we really liked, kind of just go down this whole road. There's so many Russiagators out there, and it's so easy. The programming we have, Jeremy, I mean, the CIA has implanted themselves in Hollywood. I will never, ever forgive Sylvester Stallone for making me root for the Mujahideen in Rambo 3. But it was the bad Russians that were out there. You know, all these movies out there, you know, even when Rocky 4, it's the Russian, you know what I'm saying? They just implant and program in our children's brains, in our adults' brains, that Russia is the other guys, the bad guys. They need to be stopped.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, I did an article on the CIA's infiltration of Hollywood, and they actually have a liaison office, and they're able to vet a lot of the scripts. And yeah, this goes back a long way. And I think, yeah, they've just exploited this, leaders in this last generation. I think they see things go, they realize that their own credibility is slipping. So they pull out the Russia card because they know people have been conditioned in the way that you said. And like, so when Hillary Clinton lost that election, that's what she thought of. Oh, we'll blame the Russians. And a lot of people, unfortunately, believed it because they had been conditioned in Hollywood. I mean, I think even in education institutes, Russians always come across as the bad guy, even in history courses, from my experience. And it's sad to see, as you say, independent media should go against the grain. You know, they should try and educate people to get past that conditioning. But unfortunately, they're falling into line. We see a lot of the independent media coverage over the last 5 to 10 years has subscribed to this dominant Russophobia, and it's really neutered what could have been a stronger anti-war movement against this, billion in military aid to Ukraine. Unfortunately, a lot of left-wingers supported the aid and were attacking Russia in similar terms in the mainstream, and there wasn't a large anti-war movement. And now more and more people are seeing the light that this is like another Afghanistan.
That machine is so powerful. I think about Barbara Lee, right? One of the only congresswomen to push back against the AUMF, the only one to vote against it, the only one to stand on that stage running for senator right now in the debate the other day to call for a ceasefire almost out of the gate. Yet she still is okay with funding the Ukrainian war and killing innocent people in the Donbass. Take a look at this quick little video, this mishmash I put together just to see the hysteria from the mainstream media on the left and the right, mainly the left and some independent left out there. No, that's not the video. It's the Navalny clip. I put it in the drive. Jeremy, while he's pulling that up, I'm so sorry.
Democracy Now.
Do you have anything else? Here it is. Here we go.
DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to Russia, where more than 400 people have been detained for publicly mourning the death of Alexei Navalny, who reportedly died in an Arctic prison on Friday. Navalny was 47 years old. He was the most prominent critic of Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Now to the parallel stories of a Russian patriot and an American idiot. The patriot, Alexei Navalny, the 47-year-old Russian political activist who led the most successful opposition campaign against Russian dictator Vladimir Putin for more than a decade, galvanizing primarily young Russians to stand up against their dictator, using social media and just plain bravery. So successful in exposing Putin's corruption that he was barred from running for president against Putin in 2018.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, when you become a Putin opponent and you speak out openly and you're within his reach, do you just make peace with death? Do you just know eventually, somehow, he's going to find some way to get you?
Shock, outrage after one of Vladimir Putin's sharpest critics, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, was reported dead in a Russian prison, reportedly dying after taking a walk, a fatal walk. U.S. officials are still waiting to confirm the Russian state media claim. Navalny's wife had this to say just a short time ago in front of dozens of heads of state.
If it is the truth, I would like
Putin and all his staff, everybody around him, his government, his friends, I want them know that they will be punished for what they have done with our country, with my family, and with my husband. They will be brought to justice, and this day will come soon.
Navalny knew what would happen when he returned to Russia, and he had a message for his supporters in the world when it did.
My message for the situation when I'm killed is very simple: not give up.
Do me a favor, answer this one in Russian.
И здесь у меня просто очевидная вещь. Ну, не сдавайтесь. Не надо, нельзя сдаваться. Если это произойдет...
They went out of their way to make this guy look like such a hero, right? Like that he had so many people following him. Let's bring Jeremy back in. So many people following him in Russia. I mean, it just blows my mind. They're all there. They, the language. There's this the No Agenda podcast, and they have this bell every single time a word. When they use these buzzwords, they hit the bell like bing, bing, bing. I think we're going to get a swarm of bees, Jeremy, because if we're going to sit here and dissect the left from a leftist perspective, we got to get a buzz going for all the buzzwords. The language they use to describe this, I mean, it's an art form, is it not?
Yeah, well, they use this, human rights. I think it become kind of like a political weapon, to demonize U.S. adversary like Russia and China become the, evil forces committing these human rights abuses. And there's really no political context. I mean, Navalny Scott Ritter had a piece today out calling Navalny a traitor. He was advocating for policies that would seriously harm Russia, including the sanctions that have harmed the economy he was supporting. He was he was supporting separatist movements within Russia to weaken the Russian Federation. And that's exactly what the CIA wants. And these are reasons why he was not popular within Russia. And he was advocating for largely regressive economic policies. I mean, his platform has never played up. It's just like he's created into this Gandhi or Martin Luther King type figure, but these media outlets never actually address what he stood for and what kind of policies he advocated for. And the fact that, he was compared to Donald Trump because of his anti-immigrant stance, but they never bring that up either. It's just a total media creation. And we've seen this before. I mean, you can compare it with Zelensky because it's the same kind of thing. They're turning Zelensky into this great hero and, Winston Churchill type leader. And Zelensky, has ruined his own country. And he's also advocated for economic program that allowed, Western corporation like Monsanto to buy up Ukraine's land. He's passed regressive labor laws. He supported torture and assassination of political opponents. He's banned 12 political parties. And yet through the magic of Hollywood and this PR machine, Zelensky is Mother Teresa and Winston Churchill combined. So it's similar. Yeah. You can compare that with Navalny, and you can compare it historically. You can look in the past. As I've studied history, like, the U.S. did this when Ngo Dinh Diem was the U.S. boy in South Vietnam. And he was called the shining light of Asia. And then later the Buddhists started immolating themselves in protest of his repression, and the truth came out.
Yeah. Well, both Navalny and Zelensky do like Nazis. This is Covert Magazine. This is your article right here. We're going to dive into this next part because, listen, here's my point, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so we heard all these things. There's a lot of propaganda going on. There's a lot of, programming in our schools and our movies, like we just talked about. But at what point does the left not wake up? Right? I mean, they used to be so against the deep state and the CIA and the intelligence community. Now they have on their shows ex-CIA heads of CIA and ex-CIA agents and heads of FBI and whatnot, and they praise them and whatnot, generals and all this other thing. At what point does the truth not blow it up and we say, oh, wait a second, maybe what they're telling me is not so much the truth, and maybe we should recognize this situation for what it is, especially when it comes to Alexei Navalny. Maybe he is not as popular and is the thorn in Putin's ass like mainstream media was saying. Covert Magazine, this is by our good friend Jeremy Kuzmarov. It says media comparisons of Navalny to Nelson Mandela are totally off base. That should be an insult, and we should hear more people who follow and appreciate and love what Nelson Mandela did for his country and stopping that apartheid and pushing back against this. The death of Navalny was being exploited to try and sustain U.S. military aid to Ukraine, because at the end of the day, it's all about the Benjamins. They want that money. As we see, they even dropped the border issue for the last bill and pushed it through for mostly money and aid to go to Ukraine. And what about the FTX scandal? Well, we found out Republicans in the Senate, Democrats in the House, they were all making money off this money laundering scheme called the Ukraine-Russia war. The death of Alexei Navalny at the remote Arctic penal colony is being used to try to sustain U.S. military aid to Ukraine at a time of growing congressional opposition. And after the Russians have taken control at Avdiivka, I can't say it right. Can you say it for me, Jeremy?
Avdiivka.
Say it.
Avdiivka.
I knew you were Russian. The battleground a key battleground in eastern Ukraine. The bias of the U.S. media was evident in the New York Times Sunday opinion section on February 18th, which featured the following headlines on one page: Florida's fraudster and Russia killer, the best case for U.S. aid to Ukraine, and what we can learn from Navalny. But you had just talked about the whole situation. We had kind of exposed what had gone on. We exposed exactly who he was, how, WikiLeaks had put out that he had some connections to the CIA. This is by responsible statecraft. CIA in Ukraine. Why is it not seen as a provocation? An explosive New York Times report shows how Washington needlessly fed into Russia's worst fears and predicted the invasion, justified or not. We understand that the CIA has been in Ukraine for quite some time. There's even bases, biolab bases that were in Ukraine funded by the State Department and the Pentagon. And we found this. They tracked this out. So you have now CIA bases, you have bioweapons bases, and all this is going on. With all this coming out, and I got a video here from Nico House real quick. It says, bombshell, the CIA had 12 spy bases in Ukraine since for the past decade that's specifically used to directly antagonize and undermine with all Kiev's approval. Given recent revelations of NATO wanting troops in Ukraine, was this always the plan? Let's take a look at this video really quickly, and we'll get your opinions, Jeremy, on what you think about this.
The CIA has built at least 12 bases in Ukraine right next to the Russian border. The New York Times reported on Sunday that the CIA has been using spy bases in Ukraine to directly engage and undermine Russia and, more specifically, Vladimir Putin. Now, this relationship between the CIA and Ukraine hasn't always existed. It just coincidentally started after the Maidan coup that was also facilitated by the CIA. In other words, we know the New York Times is trying to boast about how great it is the CIA has been working to undermine Putin. But in reality, what they did was informed us that Ukraine probably should have been invaded by Russia a long time ago, and Russia had every right to defend itself, considering that NATO was involved in trying to undermine their country, and they used Ukraine to do so, and Ukraine was fully aware of it. Oh, and because of the U.S. desire to just keep funding Nazis to kill ethnic Russians in Ukraine, that part too. Now, with the news that NATO powers are considering sending troops to Ukraine to fight Russia, coupled with the fact that we now know that CIA has had spy bases there since 2014, and the U.S. has admitted to even putting chemical weapons facilities in Ukraine along Russian borders as well. Now, from my vantage point, it looks like with this information that we have, no matter how much Putin tried to engage in good faith with the U.S. and NATO powers, they had always planned on military aggression with Russia. There was nothing Putin could ever do. And therefore, all the lives that have been lost in Ukraine and every life that will be lost going forward if they do choose to continue to engage with Russia, if they do continue to escalate tensions, it will be the fault of the United States and NATO. All that blood will be on their hands, and everyone who enabled them and ran cover for them in the media, it'll be on their hands too.
Jeremy, we're going to get your final thoughts and get you out of here. At the end of the day, the question is, when are Americans going to wake up and start saying, we have to be accountable for this? They shouldn't spill this blood in our name. I mean, even the fiscal conservatives should be upset by this. This is millions and millions, billions and billions, and close to trillions of dollars if you add it up. And look what happened in Afghanistan. You know, we tried to get the Taliban out only for the Taliban to take control. Your final thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think it's a good video, and I think there was long a strategy to try and kind of use Ukraine as a battering ram to weaken Russia, because Russia was emerging as a stronger power under Putin, and the U.S. wanted to dominate the entire Eurasian region, which is rich in oil and gas, and it seems key to world domination. And Putin is more of a nationalist, and the U.S. wants also access Russian natural resources. So they want a weaker leader, they want regime change, and they wanted to weaken Russia. So I think he's correct in his analysis. I think a lot of Americans don't support it, and we see that in growing congressional opposition. Unfortunately, I think it may take for a major change in policy. I think it may take a huge negative changes in the American economy. I mean, I think we're already seeing a power shift. The center of world power is shifting more to the east. It's becoming more of a multipolar world order. The American economy is weakening as other economies are strengthening. And the U.S. may lose its dollar primacy, and that's when it'll really hit home, when people are suffering. We're already suffering economically, and when we suffer more and more, I think people will turn against the elites unequivocally.
Yeah, well, the Americans better wake up, especially the left, because they're getting duped like never before. Jeremy Kuzmarov, ladies and gentlemen, he wasn't born in Russia. He wasn't a communist. He does not eat borscht twice a week, but he does like potato and gnocchi. So we're going to keep an eye on him. That's it for Left on Left, Jeremy. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Definitely. Thanks.